For that kid out there who feels like she's weird or she's different or she doesn't fit in anywhere, yes, you do. I promise you do. You do. Stay weird, stay different, and then when it's your turn and you are standing on the stage.
Hello, hello, hello. This is Uncle Tickles, and you are listening to New Dad. What is normal these days? I certainly don't fucking know. And before we entered a pandemic in perhaps the most divided period in our country's history, going back to the 60s, we had a divorce rate of 50%. And while alternative lifestyles are still very much under attack, we also live in a time where there is more openness to them than ever before. So this list of variables adds up to an equation which equals normalcy being more of an illusion than ever before. And that's all right, because being weird and being different is okay, and it's actually pretty awesome. So I'm going to make an argument for my child being abnormal, even though we don't know what normal is anymore. And it wasn't abnormal because, we were poor, and it wasn't abnormal because my parents had me at a young age, although those things were abnormal compared to a lot of the kids I was growing up with at the time. My childhood was unusual because of the shit my parents did. For example, dinner time. A regular occurrence would be for my dad to demand a large pour of milk, which is probably pretty normal for most people. But in our house, this would result in me and my siblings objecting in horror. He would just stare at us dead-eyed and ask for another refill as he slammed consecutive glasses of milk. And after dinner, it was every man and woman for themselves. The weak would be left behind. My dad, to his credit, would prey on the strongest, my brother and I, normally grab us, put us in a leg lock, and maybe now you're starting to understand why the milk was such a trigger. Yeah, he was lactose intolerant, and he would put our little toddler faces right up against his adult butthole and unleash an unholy fury of flatulence. We cried and tried with every ounce of strength to pry ourselves from his Greek godlike legs. To no avail. For his part, he would laugh like a maniac. One of the few times I actually saw the man truly happy. And it was a lifetime of shit like this and the heroin junkie babysitter that make for what I guess is non-traditional or an unusual upbringing. I do promise that our guests today are not going to claim non-traditional upbringings because their parents farted on them. No. We have two very fascinating people who coincidentally I met through the world of Ice and Fire or Game of Thrones. I have talked about the importance of having hobbies for balance and also as a good example for our children. But another benefit is they sometimes lead you to make friends with people you may not have met had it not been for that hobby. And in this case, I think it's safe to say that today's guests, Aziz and River, probably would not have crossed paths with me had it not been for the help of the wonderful George R.R. Martin. So thank you, George, for bringing me into these two people's lives. I have two people I can now call friends. Aziz is the host of my favorite A Song of Ice and Fire podcast, History of Westeros. And River, like me, is an enormous fan of this podcast. River and I met actually in the History of Westeros Facebook group where we were discussing different theories and analysis put forth by Aziz, Shea, and Sean, the good folks who run History of Westeros. So if you are a fan of Game of Thrones or A Song of Ice and Fire, I highly encourage you to go check out History of Westeros and give them some support. We do talk a little Game of Thrones in part 2 of this interview. So if you tuned in to hear Aziz flex his Westorian love muscle, I'll save you a little bit of time. You can go ahead and exit out of this one and wait for part 2 to be released. But if you do want to stick around, you're going to get to hear all about Aziz's upbringing and also learn about Rivers, which is quite an unbelievable tale in and of itself. I promise you won't regret sticking around for that one. This is an episode I'm very excited to share and was very excited to record. I do think everyone who's tuning in will be richly rewarded. So part 2 coming shortly. Without further ado, River and Aziz, Prop Cause, take us away.
Welcome back. This is Uncle Tickles. This is a very exciting evening for me because I get to talk to Aziz and River. They are here not to talk about A Song of Ice and Fire and Game of Thrones, but we're talking about unusual upbringings. And Aziz, River, I'll let River you start, and please introduce yourself to all of New Dad's listeners and watchers out there.
Hi, everybody. My name is River. I'm 42. I am the Chieftain and the Volva of the Hels Heathen Kindred in Missoula, Montana. I'm here to tell you a little bit about an unusual upbringing.
That's right. And River, you are not a parent, correct?
I'm not a parent, but I have co-parented some of my former partner's children.
Gotcha. Okay. Well, then we'll have to ask you about that a little bit later. And you and I met in a Facebook group dedicated for a specific podcast within this fandom's realm. And the host of that podcast is with us tonight, Aziz. Please introduce yourself. Most of our listeners will probably recognize you, but for those that don't, tell us a little bit about yourself.
Right on. Well, first off, thanks for having me, Tommy. It's good to be here with Uncle Tickles. So I am a professional podcaster. I've been doing this for a few years now, and it's true that lots of us meet through this community. I have certainly made most of my friends through this community as well, so that's a great thing. And this is a good example of how we branch into things that have nothing to do with that or very little to do with that, and talking about, stuff on the personal side. And so I'm looking forward to it. It's something different for me.
There's so many great content creators, but History of Westeros was one of the first ones I found. So you guys have a very close place in my heart. As a moderator for the Facebook group, it's been a pleasure to get to know you better and also the community through your podcast. Go check it out if you are at all interested in Game of Thrones or the A Song of Ice and Fire novel series. Check out History of Westeros. Please do. I promise you won't regret it. But enough about A Song of Ice and Fire for now. We will dig deeper into these unusual upbringings. And I want to kick it over to River first. The title was very impressive. I don't know that a lot of our listeners may be familiar with just the practice of being a heathen. And even the word itself, I think, for many people, probably carries a negative connotation, which is probably one of the big misunderstandings about it. So tell us a little bit about it.
So, as I said, I'm the Chieftain of the Hels Heathen Kindred, and I'm also their Volva. The Chieftain is just an elected position that's basically, the first amongst equals. I'm not like any better than anybody else in the Kindred or anything like that. My voice doesn't carry any more weight than anyone else's. I'm just there to kind of help negotiate what's happening in our group. And the Kindred is a community of, about 100 plus people who are all dedicated to heathenry, which is basically the religion of Northern and Central European peoples before the conversion to Christianity.
I assume you guys play or celebrated holidays. What did those look like?
Absolutely. Yeah. We had 8 major holidays a year, and they are equally interspersed. So the summer solstice, the winter solstice, equinoxes, and the cross quarters were observed in my household when I was young. As I've gotten older and more research has been done by reconstructionists, we've been able to determine some of the actual dates that bloats happened on. A bloat is a specific kind of sacrifice day.
Okay.
where we prepare animals and some heathens have make meat offerings instead of animals because it's modern day. Heathenry absolutely allows for, plant-based, what we consider, medicinal plants, or the sacrament, which is hallucinogenic mushrooms. And the use of hallucinogenic mushrooms in particular is deeply tied into our religious experience, so much so that it's made its way into modern day, holidays. The Santa Claus
Yeah.
is the biggest,
Your hanging
example
your
that I can think of.
stockings over the
Used.
fireplace, right?
Yeah, well, Odin is considered to be, kind of a Santa Claus figure, but specifically what would happen is that, a shaman would come around winter solstice at a time called Yule, and he would come, all the houses would be so snowed in that the only way to get in would be through a hole in the roof with a ladder, because there's like 20 feet of freaking snow in Norway. And so the shaman would come down a ladder down into the house, and he would deliver amanita mushrooms to everybody. And as you know, amanita mushrooms are not safe to eat, like while they're fresh. You have to really dry them out, very, very much so. And then they're hallucinogenic still, but not as like, they're not going to cause problems, but they have to be really dry. And so the shaman was like entrusted with, the task of like taking these mushrooms and drying them out properly, or else they could make the community very sick. And then the community would eat the mushrooms together, and they would have this, sense of camaraderie, because the oxytocin and the, other, dopamine and things like that in their brains are being released by the mushrooms. And reindeer are, jumping after eating these mushrooms, and twitching led to like the reindeer flying and like landing on the roofs, because, the shaman comes and it's, the snow is up to the roof. And so there's a lot of old traditions from heathenry that have made it into modern day, culture and Christian, especially European Christian, Western European Christian faith.
And what would you say are the major tenets of it?
Heathenry, our basic tenets are animism, which means we believe that everything, even inanimate objects, have like life force, the force running through them, and that those objects, retain, energy from what's around them, by interacting with them. So like if you go to a stone and you make, a sacrifice there, and you have a ritual there, that stone is going to pick up the memory of that forever,
Was it hard to fit in for you as a child?
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. My childhood was, magical. I was, told to go find fairies. So, my early childhood was really magical. And, my parent was a vegetarian, and we lived in Los Angeles, and it was very posh to be alternative. And so, my mom discovered heathenry that way, and quickly became very much, involved, because, it has to do with like ancestry. We moved around a lot actually before ending up here in Montana. My mom was a single mother. My mom struggled a lot with having two young children without a father for either of them, and being alternative was very difficult.
Did you know your dad, or was he around at all? Was he in the picture?
So it's very complex. Early heathens and, a lot of Christians were white supremacists, and my mom's family was pretty damn racist. And my mom fell in love with the Jewish boy from down the street, and she was like 16, and they ran away, and she got pregnant and had me when she was 17. And his mom refused to let him marry my mom because my mom wasn't Jewish. And so I didn't really know my dad. He wasn't around. He, put eyes on me a couple times, but that's it. And I didn't get to know my grandmother until my 30s on his side. My dad died of HIV during the AIDS HIV crisis in the 90s in Los Angeles.
Wow. Well, hearing that, there's a lot of parallels to our other guest, Aziz, and we're I want to circle back around and talk about how your mom kind of handled that tough hand she was dealt. But before we do, Aziz, tell everyone a little bit about your upbringing, because again, there are so many parallels just listening to River talk. It's kind of eerie.
Yeah, my grandparents, my mother's parents, moved around a lot because my grandfather was military, and at age 17, also my mother had me, and my father was 18 at the time, and he was in the. Here's another parallel to the document that we've laid out for this episode. They were in the Children of God.
Oh wow!
And when I was born, my mom was like, "Wait a sec." She kind of snapped out of it, kind of to use almost her own words there, and was like, "No, I'm not doing this." But he was still pretty into it. He didn't actually stick with it that long, but technically he was only around for like the first 6 months of my life at most. And then he went off and had more kids with other women. And my mother was very disciplined because of the military upbringing, but she was also a musician. So she took more after my grandmother, who was an artist. So she had that, combination of traits. And so I ended up moving around a lot as well because she was going to different schools, climbing the academic ladder to be a professor eventually. And that meant, and she was also pretty picky. So at one point we moved to we moved to Vermont at one point, and after about 3 weeks she was like, nah.
And it wasn't just the apartment, it was the state of Vermont. She was just, nah.
I don't know if it was the state, but yeah, I think it was just a combination because it was Brattleboro, Vermont, pretty small spot, real small, really. That might have been part of what she didn't like about it because she didn't think that was necessarily ideal for me either, to be in such a, not to have very few people to interact with, because that's already a problem, as I'm sure River could attest. You have, unless you're thrust into some large community, your parents don't have they don't have people their age that they don't have kids also. Usually that's a real common thing, right? You have, a lot of times you and your friends have kids within the same range. Even if it's not like the same year, it's within the same few years. But like if you have a kid at 17, you probably don't have a friend that has a kid.
You hope not. You hope not, right?
So like anybody that has kids is probably several years older, if not like a lot older. And so you don't have that natural sort of village raising a child thing. And that's compounded by moving around. So there's not even, these existing friendships aren't there, plus new friendships aren't that likely to form with existing mothers because they just aren't in her age group. And so that kind of snowballs a bit. So I definitely didn't have a lot of long-term friendships in my early life. They would only last like a year or two because we didn't live anywhere more than until I was in high school. I didn't live anywhere more than 3 years.
Did you have a favorite place you lived?
Good question. Well, I guess I could run through it real quick. I was born in Winston-Salem, North Carolina, and then moved to College Park, Maryland. That was 3 years. And then Brooklyn, New York for 2 years. And I went to different schools each of those 2 years. And then there was almost Vermont, and then that turned into Cincinnati, Ohio for 3 years. Then Bowling Green, Ohio, which is right outside Toledo. That was 3 years also. And every summer was spent in Colorado. Because she played the music festival there every year. So there was also, basically, those were all not full years. Those were 3 seasons.
Broken.
And then, right. And then, I guess maybe Tallahassee was my favorite, but I'm just biased because that's the one I stayed in longer and got to develop lasting friendships. So they all had interesting things about them, but yeah, Tallahassee was where I went to high school, and I was motivated to not go to college elsewhere because I didn't want to move anymore. I was tired of all that moving. So I stayed there and went to Florida State, and it worked out pretty well because I wanted to. Well, I didn't know what I wanted to do, but I was interested in music, and the classical guitar program is really good, and that is what I ended up doing. But mostly it was just about not wanting to move. I was like, I'm staying here.
And I wondered, as a result, did you and your mom have an especially close bond? Because seeing that she didn't have a lot of people to relate to, and you guys are moving around, I imagine that could be the case.
Yeah, we did for sure. I didn't have siblings. Well, I did. I just didn't know them until I was an adult. But I didn't grow up with siblings, and I didn't know my father's side of the family either. I did eventually meet them too, and that went well because they don't like him either. So, but yeah, so we were tight that way. We would drive. We had all these huge long car trips that we had every year because those Colorado trips were by car. So we would drive there with all the stuff in the car and listen to comedy tapes. We would listen to stand-up comedy tapes, and I swear that is part of why I'm a podcaster now, because I got influenced heavily by Steve Martin, George Carlin, Bill Cosby, the Smothers Brothers, and just hearing them, I would memorize their routines, and that had a deep impact.
Have you read Born Standing Up?
Which is that Steve Martin's one?
Yeah, Steve Martin.
Yes.
Yeah.
I couldn't remember the title, but yeah, that was really good.
Fantastic.
I read that on a flight. Really? Yeah, you're right. It's really good. I mean, it's really concise, and you could read it in like it's 2 sittings or one sitting. And I was super interested in that. I didn't know he's so like hard working,
multi-talented, magic, music, comedy, everything.
But the discipline he had is what struck me the most. That guy's discipline was like, okay, this is the most special thing about him, that he would do like 340 shows in a year. Like what? Yeah. And never didn't like tried drugs like once. Was like, I'm not into that. Yeah. And it was like never tempted again. Like how is that easy?
How did he put it? He didn't like his performance on it, so he's like, no, don't need to do it.
Yeah,
I wasn't as good.
Very dedicated. Yeah, just it was like, this is the thing that matters. If it affects this bottom line, I'm not into it. Yeah, so super focused. That's really interesting. So that's kind of inspiring in that way too. And on one hand, it's like legendary how disciplined and focused he was. On the other hand, it's like if you can grab 2% of that for yourself, then you've improved a lot. So yeah, he's inspiring.
I guess I didn't know this about River, so we could probably apply these next 2 questions to both of you. Did you feel any pressure to kind of be, without a dad in the picture, to kind of be the man of the house, or to grow up a little faster than maybe a normal kid your age?
I guess, yeah.
No, I didn't. It was almost more of the opposite. They probably, my grandparents were generous, so like even though we moved a lot and I was maybe underparented, I didn't have we didn't like lack for the basics. We had car and all those things, even though someone normally in her situation may have lacked for those things. She didn't, because she was also an only child, so she was not spoiled, but they were in fine shape and had no one else to take care of, and ditto my mother. So even though she'd normally in that situation, she'd have been struggling, she wasn't. So there was no pressure on me to
grow up fast.
Yeah. Now, I was interested in having my own money. I did start working, like doing my own stuff really early. I started selling newspapers when I was 12, and then just had lots of small jobs like that. But it was purely so I could buy stuff. It wasn't for need. Yeah, it was definitely for hobbies and games. It was not for necessities. So that was lucky. That was definitely on the privileged side, but also formative. It's super relevant because you talk about having the warrior background, ditto my family, but it was like a long line of all the men in my family were military, including Confederates. There was one time we were at dinner, and they tell me the story. This table you're eating on, you know, your great grandmother like stopped the Yankees from taking it. I'm like, oh, interesting. So luckily, there's also like lots of evidence that they're like progressive for their era. You know, they were like good in that sense. So I'm like, okay, well, that's cool. But, so that's, so there's like this long tradition of military there. I have inherited all, since I'm an only child of an only child, I inherited all this like military stuff, all these like medals and trinkets and gear. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about. And so there was never any pressure on me to do that. I'm sure my grandfather would have been thrilled if I did. My mother would not have been, because she, you know, probably was wiser about it, you know, but also they didn't put any pressure on her to do it. I think it was more of the men in my family had that pressure on them, and she didn't have any of that. She was pressured to be disciplined and to work hard, but not to be in the military specifically. And, you know, my grandfather fought in Korea and Vietnam, so there may have been some of like, that wasn't great.
Not the most supported wars. Well, and it's interesting from my standpoint. You know, I think of it just from my own, and the reason I just assume that is, you know, I had both parents in my house. You know, both my parents are still married, and because of them being young, struggling, having to work a lot. You know, we talked in one of our episodes about me being a latchkey kid at the first grade, and walking home with my brothers and sisters, and being home alone from really like 3 o'clock in the afternoon till about 6 p.m. And it was, I was cooking them meals. I was making sure, you know, no one was really getting out of line. And as a result, I had a great childhood still. I would classify it as that, but I do feel that I had to grow up a little fast. So, you know, it's always interesting when you hear a situation where, you know, maybe someone was even dealt, I don't want to say a worse hand than our family, but, you know, they, you know, maybe had less means and were able to still make it work. So that's encouraging. And I think if there are single parents listening, you know, we're going to talk here in a second about how, you know, Aziz's mom was able to still allow him to have a childhood and feel like a kid and not have to grow up too fast. It also sounds like, Aziz, just from, you know, your description of your mother, she was young, but she was also driven. She was a talented musician. She was, you said, trying to climb the academic ladder there. So perhaps it wasn't, again, the same as my experience, where my parents were young, and as a result, I was exposed to, you know, parties and drugs and alcohol at an early age. Maybe sounding like not the case for you. Is that an accurate statement?
Yeah, so it's a good point, because thinking more about growing up quickly, I didn't have to, in the sense of like having to make my own way financially, even though I did so anyway. But in terms of growing up emotionally, that I did have to do more on my own, because my mother, being that age, wasn't super wise about it herself. I mean, she had the discipline was academic. The discipline was like waking up before me as a baby, and practicing for 4 hours, because I was a baby who slept in. She would wake up at 5 and practice for 4 hours. So
oh my God,
that's a great example to set, that I never lived up to anything like that. But certainly, I mean, let alone waking up that early, I am a night person, as you can see from my baby's habits, my habits as a baby, rather. So, but yeah, she was gone a lot. I had to be other places a lot. I was on my own a lot. So I had to, by myself. So I had to deal with that and make my own, you know, take care of myself in that sense, like go through the effort. Right. There wasn't a struggle for having things, but I did have to do it myself. Like I cooked my own dinners like half the week and things like that. Gotcha. So, you know, no big deal, but certainly significant, you know, relevant or whatever.
For sure. But you didn't have a hand holding you the whole way.
Right.
In a lot of cases.
Exactly. It was neither a struggle nor was it like super, super easy. And compared to like people I was around, I saw a lot more structure with other families. Not more structure, but more
Consistency.
maybe more consistency, but more like presence, right? Because there's two of them,
Right. Yeah,
or
for sure.
and let alone siblings. So like there a lot of times that's the thing, like you said, in both y'all's cases, you had younger siblings, and that automatically gives you some responsibility. I think if you're even a little bit decent, and obviously that's setting the bar pretty low. Most people take more responsibility. It sounds like both of y'all in that category took a lot of responsibility for your siblings. But, I just didn't have that. I didn't have it to think about it all. All we had was, cats or something. So, so it's a different kind of approach to it. Although my mom did have long-term boyfriends that were sort of like father figures, but that's a different topic, I suppose.
Well, I guess it does kind of go back to the man of the house. Did you feel protective as a young guy growing up with these long-term boyfriends, or were they just long-term enough that you felt comfortable?
My mom was just so tough. I never felt like
A need to be protective?
Yeah, no, it was just never a thing. I just don't recall. That's like, there are other things I can recall that weren't perfect. But she just always seemed like, she did want to be a professor. She had that in charge kind of attitude anyway. She's small, but, one of those people that just can dominate when she wants to. And like, don't get on her bad side. It's rare that you will. She is usually really nice, but yeah, she can turn it on.
Sounds like my yaya.
And she probably got that from her parents. Her mother was very strict, and her father was military. So from a disciplinarian background, even if he wasn't as much himself specifically, but they were also a couple that like they met in high school. My grandfather had like 2 other girls he dated in his life. Right? So that's a total, like, they couldn't relate to each other on anything like that, right? So there was no like, a lot of times you think about like where your lessons come from because of the experiences that your own family had before you. There was none of that to pass down. None of them had normal relationship advice for me because none of them had normal relationships, right? They had all of their resume of relationships was either like, well, I have no experience at all because I married my high school sweetheart, or my mom's like, well, I am just too different of any sort of thing to model after because I had a kid at 17, and then you're a single mom, and then what advice does a single mom have for me? Right? Like, that's a totally different
world. Yeah. Unrelatable.
Yeah. So like, I can only respect that and be like, boy, that must be hard. But it's not applicable to me directly. Obviously it's like, I have more respect if I was dating someone and I'm like, oh, they're a single mom, I'd approach it differently. So it definitely has that impact.
Now, River, I want to ask you about being exposed to some of these more adult type of, I guess, concepts, ideas, things. Was it something that you in heathenry that you were exposed to, or maybe it was even
absolutely
not related to? Okay, yeah, please jump into it. Yeah.
Absolutely. So, heathenry has, kind of also a dark side. There's a side of heathenry that is really racist. There's a side of heathenry that is associated with like black metal bands and biker gangs, and my mom went from being like the nature heathen to the biker gang heathen when I was about 9 years old. And so she married, a guy in a biker gang who was extremely racist, and he basically ruled our household with an iron fist until I was about 14. And there was a lot of physical things that were happening in the house. It's one of the reasons why I'm a pacifist now. Like, if I can't resolve something with words and a calm demeanor, then I'm a failure, kind of thing. Strictly because we had some serious, abuse happen in our household for a few years while my mom was attached to this man. Eventually, my mom slipped into intravenous drug use and severe neglect of her children. And it led to my grandmother having to take care of me, my grandfather having to take care of me and my brother. And, you know, for a while there, it was really bad. I ran away from foster homes multiple times in the few years that I was in foster care.
You're growing up in this culture where the warrior is valued, and you're the eldest. You've kind of talked about this, early motivation to look out for your siblings and grow up fast. So I imagine that this 5-year span with this abusive gentleman was even especially challenging for you during, considering how that clashed with your upbringing.
Yeah, absolutely. It seemed, it was such a drastic shift from what I had known. We were vegetarian before, now we eat meat, Before we could say whatever we wanted, now we have to be careful about what we say. Before we could eat whatever we wanted, and now you have to ask. There was a lot of rules, whereas in my early childhood, like I said, it was really magical. There wasn't really, much going on there, that was like restrictive. I played with goats and played in the woods and picked flowers and now all of a sudden there's like, people up for days in my living room taking apart motorcycles. My stepdad once came home covered in blood, head to toe. No explanation, had been gone for 3 days, So things got really dark and really ugly. And then they took, my brother and I away. And, I ended up eventually back in the care of my grandparents who, were not really prepared to take care of children again. They had adopted my mother when she was an infant, and both of my parents were actually adopted. My father was a foundling, and my mother was adopted out of the hospital. But it was very difficult for my grandparents. They didn't want to raise 2 more young children again. And so I, went and got emancipated. And by the time that I got emancipated, my parents, my mom and my stepdad got clean and started putting back, their life together. My mom got really, really religious again, and much, much more so into heathenry than ever before. Like deeper into the culture, deeper into, everything to kind of replace that, hole that the drugs were filling, and my stepdad eventually left the picture, and, it took a lot of years of counseling, to deal with that. And, I've been through a lot of changes in my life, obviously, and the word that kind of defined my life for a long time was vicissitudes. It's,
I don't know that word.
It means rapid change through force.
Okay.
And that just defined my life, for a really long time. And I had a hard time coping, and I did a lot of soul searching, and I did a lot of psychedelics. And, I avoided, I avoided anything that was related to any of that darkness, and kind of worked through what that was all about, with like some really good counselors, and, eventually was able to come to like some closure.
After hearing that, do you ever have any dreams or intentions of being a parent?
Oh God, no.
Okay.
No, we have an English bulldog, and I have no intention of ever becoming a parent. My brother has 4 beautiful children who I love and love being around, but I have no desire, and neither does my fiance, desire to have children. we're selfish and like we like our nerd stuff too much to have kids. So yeah.
Well, I kind of want to bring it back to Aziz at this point. You talked about moving around a lot. What was your mom doing to help I guess alleviate this unusual upbringing? So some of the challenges that come along with being a single parent without having a dad around.
Thing she did to alleviate, I guess that would be, she would enroll me or encourage me to be involved in like leagues or community sports, things like that. I did some after school programs, things of that nature. And that was good because that was also necessary for her in terms of her schedule. And I would also end up at a lot of friends' houses for the weekend. She would call around to different parents that I was friends with and would, tell them, she had to travel for work or go somewhere and, could I stay with them for the weekend? So I had a lot of interesting, like, weekends of living with someone else's family because I would do, all the stuff they did since it's a whole weekend, which on a weekend, that includes going to church for most families, especially in Tallahassee. But they would be different, and there would be all these different variety. And this also would extend to be me being in middle school. So I went to synagogue. I went to a variety of Christian churches, including Korean church, which is definitely the least interesting because I couldn't understand. It was all in Korean,
right.
It wasn't like anything about the actual content. I just could not perceive a single bit of it. So
just looking around trying to take cues. Like,
yeah, okay, everybody's all right, the hands, okay. Yeah. But so that was interesting, just like seeing how these different families live. So that was a different slice of it's not just like most kids, you go over to their house for a few hours, or maybe you do a sleepover every once in a while. I would be there for, the whole, like 2 nights, or maybe even 3. I might even go to school with them on, because we go to the same school. And so that was good. That wasn't a bad thing. It was unusual, but it certainly wasn't bad because none of those families were, problematic or anything. Nothing I could think of was like, oh, it didn't work out that she stuck me with them. So I think she was pretty careful about that. She would talk to them, and she had a pretty good sense of, like she's pretty good at judging people.
Right.
Like she had a good intuition about people. And to, back to the earlier point, I don't think I've really answered it that clearly about being around drugs and alcohol. Yeah, no, there was like none of that. I mean, they were like super disciplined about that. My grandmother became an alcoholic over time. She was like self-medicating and then just became, a heavy drinker. But that's it. My mom, like, one time had a little bit of pot with me and she was hilarious. But she's the way she describes it, like, I'm high naturally. I'm like, yeah, you pretty much are. So it just, and so so she stayed away from, that wasn't part of her, like it wasn't going to be a good thing for her to be, being a disciplined musician, classical musician type, which is highly focused on practicing a lot. Those are some disciplined people. So it just was not a good compatible lifestyle at all. Worked out more. It is more for me, but not for them. I remember her being, strong about a lot of things, but not forcing a lot of them on me. That was something, like she was vegetarian. She went vegetarian like when I was kind of young, not like maybe like around 12, but she didn't push it on me even a little. She was just like, yeah, I don't, I'm not going to eat meat anymore. So when I prepare food, there's not going to be meat in it, but you can eat whatever, you can get what you want. You can make your own food and, she'd still pay for the groceries and I could make my own food. So that was fine. No big deal there. And I did try, I've been vegetarian a few times in my life. So I guess that I have to assume that had an impact on me in some way. When I was really young, she would take me to rehearsals. So that included playing she would be in like an orchestra pit And so I'm like a 4-year-old kid out, and there's nobody there.
Right.
This, it's a rehearsal. So, but they're playing in the actual orchestra pit. So I'm just running around with my G.I. Joe or whatever, and just hanging out there. So this is, kind of unusual to be there. Most kids would have been at home.
Yeah.
So I think like River, for different reasons or some overlap, I was also very adaptable because they would just have to put me somewhere. I would have to be like, okay, what are we going to do with the kid? He's okay by himself. He'll just play with his toys or read. Like I would read a lot of books, right? And that was, I could credit that too, now that we mention it. So that's the thing, like having to find something to do with me or something for me to do while adult things happened that, there wasn't the structure for me to be in a normal situation, whatever normal means. But
Right, exactly.
so it wasn't bad. Like I don't look at this as bad,
Right.
It's just different, and I guess that has its own value in seeing the world differently. There's lots of advantages to having a different perception of things. That's where a lot of opportunity in life comes from. If you're like someone who sees things differently, sometimes it just makes you sound crazy,
True.
but sometimes you can make a living at it or something.
Absolutely. Or even just from the simple benefit of understanding, right? If you think differently, a lot of times it's easier for you to understand, or, a lot of other people's plights or situations.
That's true. Like I didn't see a lot of people's struggles so much as I was just in a lot of people's situations, like living in their house for a few days at a time. I would just experience this, and sometimes it was negative, like families fight. And you see some things that like, ooh, that now, especially looking back now, I can think of some of these parents were like, ooh, that was some bad parenting, by that father there, that mother. They were, and I think, oh yeah, they were really strict Catholics, so kind of makes sense. Their families probably really strict with them, and et cetera, et cetera. You just think how far back it goes, and so yeah, I think that does give you an appreciation for not only the adaptable thing is true, but also you experiencing a variety of other people's lifestyles, even if they're still kind of in a narrow range. Like I wasn't exactly spending these weekends with a variety of socioeconomic situations, right? These were pretty much all middle class, like upper middle class white families, right? So that's, on that hand, it wasn't diverse in that sense, but it was more diverse than living in one household.
For sure. Correct me if I'm mistaken. I thought I remember you at one point saying that, a lot of your mom's friends, which this would make sense, right? She didn't have a lot of parents that were her age. So a lot of her friends were younger females around her age. So, you were surrounded, I would assume, by a lot of younger females. Did you find yourself having an easier time getting along with women or girls growing up than guys, or?
No. The opposite probably. I got along really well with my mother, but I was always like, I did not get along with other like adult women,
Mm-hmm.
but my mom didn't have, like, that never happened. I never had friends. My mom's friends were not like other parents. She just made friends that were other women and they would have, like she just didn't have a lot of friends when she was younger. I think that's really just the bottom line, is that she just had she had other students, like she had colleagues that were kind of friends and people she played music with, like she played in quartets, like side gigs, and those were kind of her friends, I guess, but none of them had kids. So, and then when she was a professor, everyone that she did have friends that had kids, but that's because all her friends were now 15, 20 years older. So those kids were adults. So it wasn't, they were maybe had a similar path, but they weren't, synced up on the chronology of those paths. Like she was, earlier on that path. So I guess, but I didn't, I mostly had, I didn't really have female friends when I was younger that much, until I started like dating or whatever. But I was mostly shy around women. Maybe because my mother was such a strong personality. I don't know. I never had that dug up by a therapist or anything, but it kind of makes sense. But so I don't know. I guess that I got over that mostly, but I'm not sure It's mostly been like, I have a lot of respect for especially mothers, single mothers, but it didn't translate into me like having early life friendships with a lot of women, but I do now. I have more friendships with women than guys now as I'm older. At least ones that have formed within the last like 10 years.
Well, there you go. That's because of mom.
Yeah, I think so.
So, River, it sounds a little bit like towards the end. When I say towards the end, I mean, from the time you were 9 to 14, your mom did not do a great job of maybe mitigating some of the challenges that come with an unusual upbringing.
Yeah, my mom stopped coping.
Before that, where it wasn't that way, where she was helping you cope with these things.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Talk about specifically what she did to help, when she was in her good phases.
Oh yeah. My mom, before my mom started using drugs, my mom was a very attentive mother. She was very caring. She cared a great deal about my education. I watched a lot of PBS as a child. I watched a lot of documentaries, which is something that I still do. I was taught how to read very early. Growing up in Los Angeles, we had a swimming pool, so she taught me how to swim very early. And being a heathen, she also, had these wild parties called symbols, and it's where people drink mead and get just kind of schnockered, and it was definitely a wild time, and I have some very good memories, and with some really great people, and there were reasons why my mom used drugs. My mom lost hope because my mom secretly identified as a man. My parent is transgender and has actually now gone through surgery to become, the man that my parent wants to be. And so my mom is now my dad. And that's pretty unusual,
For sure.
And I had to come to terms with that. I always knew as a child that my mom identified that way.
Okay, we are going to end part 1 of the Aziz and River interview now. I know, holy fucking cliffhanger. Tune in for part 2, where we'll finish hearing about Aziz and River's upbringings, as well as talk a little A Song of Ice and Fire, which I have a feeling is what a lot of you are tuning in for. So that will be part 2. As I said, should be a few days, Monday at the latest. I appreciate you tuning in. I appreciate River and Aziz spending so much time talking to me for this episode, and hope you guys stay safe. Uncle Tickles loves you. Prop cause, take us away.